Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all to some poetry for the next few minutes, and then some cake. So have a seat, and thank you very, very much for coming this afternoon. I'm really happy to be here reading poetry from my brand new book. I just got the box from my publisher on Friday of the books for today. I was kind of sweating, like, I hope they get here in time. My book is Climbing the Fire Escape, Flipping the Raft, Poems on Women in Movies. And it's published by Finishing Line Press, which is a small press in Kentucky, Georgetown, Kentucky. And I've worked with them before on my very first book, which came out about 14 years ago. And I was very happy to work with them again on this book. And I'm going to talk a lot more about the origins of the book and go into some more detail. But I just want to basically say right now that during COVID, as a way of coping and trying to stay strong during this time when there were no places to go except internally into books, which I'm accustomed to going to. But during COVID, I turned to movies as an alternative to reading, as a way to cope with COVID, and as a way to find strength and courage and resilience. UUs talk a lot about resilience, and it kind of waxes and wanes, and it kind of waned during COVID for me. But I started watching movies with an eye to the women characters, and I was looking for, of course, ways to cope and stay strong and all of that. But I was especially looking at women taking bold action in really difficult times. Women fighting monsters like in Alien and Aliens, women fighting against bad guys, and there are so many movies about fighting against bad guys. And so I really paid attention to the women who were doing bold things. And I decided to title this book, Climbing the Fire Escape, Flipping the Raft, because of two of the movies in this book. One I'm going to start with stars Meryl Streep, and the other has Grace Kelly, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But thank you for coming, and I'm going to start with a poem dedicated to Meryl Streep, and each of these poems is dedicated to the actress who's starring in the film. And this, if you're following along, it's on page 17. And this poem is a mirror sonnet, meaning the 14 lines of a traditional sonnet happen, and then I go back over those 14 lines in the second stanza and tinker with them, make a few revisions to them, but they're essentially the same lines, kind of altered slightly. You may or may not have seen this movie. It's called The River Wild, and Meryl Streep plays a river raft guide who encounters some bad guys and ultimately triumphs. So, The River Wild Mirror Sonnet. Gail Hartman, 40-something, fit and circumspect, teacher, mother, wife. Her husband Tom's an architect, too buried in his work to fly to Idaho for their son Rourke's raft trip. Gail mourns, but packs the gear into the boat, a skilled guide years ago. Rourke befriends two guys, scores a ball cap from Wade, who chats up Gail, applauds her rafting expertise. In mid-flirtation, Tom shows up. He's changed his mind. It turns out Wade and the sidekick are ex-cons. They've pulled a heist. Now, on the lam, they need Gail's help. Wade's got a gun, aims at Rourke's dog. He punches Tom, and kills a cheerful ranger in a red kayak. Gail and Tom devise a plan. They'll flip the boat, and Wade can't swim. They reconcile, but Wade won't drown. Gail ends up shooting him. They reconcile, but Wade won't drown. Gail ends up shooting him. She and Tom devised the plan to flip the boat. Wade couldn't swim, but killed a cheerful ranger in a red kayak. Wade had a gun aimed at Rourke's dog and punched Tom. They'd pulled a heist, were on the lam, needed Gail's help. It turned out Wade and Sidekick were ex-cons. In mid-flirtation, Tom showed up. He'd changed his mind and sought out Gail to praise her rafting expertise, but Rourke befriended two guys, scored a ball cap from Wade. So much gear in the boat. Gail, a skilled guide years ago, now led Rourke's raft trip. Mourned her husband's pact, so buried in his work. He flew to Idaho. Teacher, mother, wife to Tom, an architect. Gail Hartman, 40-something, fit and circumspect. Thanks so much. This next poem is based on a very famous Alfred Hitchcock movie I'm hoping you've seen, Rear Window, in which Jimmy Stewart is confined to a wheelchair and uses binoculars to determine a crime has happened across the courtyard from his apartment. And he has a beautiful girlfriend, played by Grace Kelly, who, in her party dress and high-heeled shoes, climbs the fire escape into the murderer's apartment, and Jimmy Stewart is watching through his binoculars. And so this is called Rear Window Pantoum for Grace Kelly. And by the way, a pantoum has repeating lines, so you'll hear these lines braided over and over again throughout the poem. Rear Window Pantoum. Lisa Carol Fremont, a fashionista in love with a photojournalist, flicks on 3 lamps, one for each of her names, in Jeff's dim apartment. His leg in a cast, he contemplates breaking up. She's too Park Avenue for him. She has lobster plus chilled wine delivered from 21, where she lunched earlier. She flicks on 3 lamps, one for each of her names. In Jeff's dim apartment, her playful mood evaporates when he broaches splitting up, after eating lobster plus chilled wine delivered from 21, where she lunched earlier. She closes the door softly, returns the next night, another chiffon gown. Her playful mood evaporates when he broaches splitting up. She has tenacity and grit, though. She's no lightweight. Sure, she closes the door softly, returns the next night, another chiffon gown, but she and the insurance company nurse join forces to solve a crime. They have tenacity and grit. No lightweights, they take a shovel, dig for clues. Jeff's stuck watching in his wheelchair. Lisa and the insurance company nurse join forces to solve a crime. Jeff's a voyeur, a frozen detective. They're intrepid investigators in high heels. They take a shovel, dig for clues. Jeff's stuck watching in his wheelchair, alarmed when Lisa climbs the fire escape into the neighbor Thorwald's window. The voyeur, frozen detective, watches the intrepid investigator in high heels and calls the cops, who arrive as Thorwald is just about to strangle her. Unalarmed, Gail climbed the fire escape into the neighbor Thorwald's window, looking for more clues, finds the missing wife's wedding ring in a drawer. The cops arrive as Thorwald is just about to strangle her. They take her to the precinct for questioning. No handcuffs necessary. Looking for clues, she'd put on her finger the missing wife's wedding ring. Off camera, Lisa brings the cops up to speed. A murder with knives. At the precinct for questioning, no handcuffs necessary. But they're essential later. Thorwald breaks in, shoves Jeff out his own window. Off camera, Lisa brings the cops up to speed. A murder with knives. Cops arrive in Jeff's dim apartment, cuff Thorwald, who confesses promptly. What's essential the day after Thorwald breaks in, shoves Jeff out his own window? A nap. Sunlight on two broken legs. Lisa nearby, skimming Vogue. Thank you. I wanted to start with those two poems because they're the poems that make up the title of the book, and I just want to say publicly thank you to my dear friend of 30 years who was a longtime member of this church, Nancy Buffum. Nancy created the cover, I commissioned her to do a custom cover, and I said, do what you want, just anything that has something to do with bold women in movies. And so this is Meryl Streep, on her raft, and this is Grace Kelly climbing the fire escape. So thank you to Nancy Buffum for a beautiful cover. This next poem I'm going to read is, let's see what to say about it. I once or twice a year go on retreat to try to get some writing done and take a break from teaching and my routine. And I love going to Tomales Bay and looking out at the water and the birds and the sky. And I get a fair amount of writing done. And one retreat, after writing during the day, I watched on the TV in the hotel room Titanic, which I've seen many, many times. And it was late at night when I was watching Titanic. And the next day, this is the poem that emerged. It's called Watching Titanic on Retreat at Tomales Bay, dedicated to Kate Winslet. I know how this ends. Jack freezes, Rose lives. It's 1 a.m. I'm muting the remote, afraid the screaming will wake the people next door. Who am I to mess with a good night's sleep for strangers? I know how this ends. Rose blows a whistle. It's feeble at first. They almost miss her, the rescuers, row past bobbing corpses in life preservers. But Rose blasts away in the dark ocean. I know how this ends. Rose hides in a cloak, eludes the horrid fiancé who had chased her with a gun but kept missing each shot. They marry others. Rose gets very old, becomes a potter. I know how this ends. There's a twist with the diamond. I click off, though. It's crazy late. I'm sick of the ads for online weight loss, befores and afters, supposedly proof. I drift off by 3. And I'm going to read 2 more poems, and then we're going to have a conversation. One of my favorite movies of my adult life is Thelma and Louise. However, I, like lots and lots of people, are not happy with how that movie ends. So I envisioned a different way to have that movie end. So this is called Thelma and Louise Alternate Ending, dedicated to Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis. No driving off the cliff into blue sky. Instead, you pocket the ignition key, surrender to a system that will try you fairly, understanding fully why you shot a rapist, why you had to flee and drive off in a panic, warm night sky, embracing, sheltering. You testify, the courtroom still, but steeped in empathy. Surrender to our system. Wise allies will counsel you, lend hands and minds, untie hard knots of fear and guilt. And therapy will feel like driving into vast blue sky, yet bind you to our earth. Your bright new life, belonging to a sisterhood of Me Too, and surrendering the search for why it happened on your fishing trip. Mourn, cry, but hold fast to your ingenuity. No driving off the cliff into blue sky. Surrender, craft new systems. Do not die. Thank you for listening. It's been such a pleasure reading for you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. This last poem is about a movie I've probably seen the most in my life. I started watching this movie on television when I was about 4 years old. They showed it every Easter, I think, or Thanksgiving, I can't remember, but I watched it on TV all through my childhood, and then a lot of times as an adult over the years. This is an abecedarian, meaning the first line begins with A, the second line begins with B, all the way through the alphabet. The last line begins with a Z. And instead of Dorothy, I decided I would write a poem to Auntie M, giving her some advice about how to welcome Dorothy home from Oz. So this is The Wizard of Oz, abecedarian, dedicated to Clara Blandick, who played Auntie M. Auntie M, believe her. While you, Henry, and the farmhands huddled below ground, Dorothy ran with Toto in her arms, crossed dry Kansas soil, her gingham dress slapping like a ship's sail. She used every muscle to pull against the storm cellar door. Frantic, she stomped again and again with her shoe. Girls everywhere witnessed the advancing tornado, wished her family underground would hear her, rescue her. But no, instead, we saw your house swirl into the sky, Dorothy inside, journeying alone, so far from her kin. M, you must be kind, be patient with her. Reconciling may take a long time for you both. She has slept among poppies, seen so many colors you never will, appraised radical new ideas, dreaded sand draining through a witch's hourglass. Oz has changed her. People do return to their roots, embrace wholeheartedly their quiet kin, resume crocheting projects, braiding rugs, canning for winter. Listen closely to her stories, though, M. She may speak fondly of scarecrows, lions, tin men. She may stammer about dark sky under the wings of flying monkeys, a man's voice and face enormous in a hall, until Toto, with his small dog mouth, pulled back a curtain, exposing an unremarkable fellow, a huckster in a bolo tie. Your faith will be tested, M. Sit together in the parlor. Repair zippers and trousers for the farmhands. There's no place like home. Thank you all. Now we're going to talk, and I'm going to get a little water.
We're pulling forward the curtain to hide to hide the man in the bolo tie and the random storage things that have ended up there. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you, and congratulations on this newest volume of poetry. And I noticed there are some of your other volumes of poetry that are also for sale, and it's so wonderful to have poets among us here at First U Society of San Francisco. I just participated in a memorial service yesterday for Ket Ziegart, who was an artist who was part of Atelier 17, this printmaking artists cooperative, and has a piece that MoMA bought and a piece that the DeYoung has, and also was a poet, and was reminded that when she came to this church, Harry Schofield was the minister, and he had this practice of living by heart, he called it, which was about memorizing a work of poetry as a sacred text that you memorized and sat with as it unfolded its layers of meaning for you, spirit working through poetry, as it does through the creation of poetry and writing. So I would love to ask some questions, and I think probably some of you have questions. And I thought you said a little bit about the background of how this volume got its genesis. And what I wanted to ask you is, how, for those who haven't read your full body of work, are there ways in which this book is different than what has come before, or there are threads that have sort of a different life, or?
That's a wonderful question. Most of my other books didn't begin as a concept for a book. Most of my other books, I was writing poetry and reached a point where, oh, hey, I have enough poems now. You know, typically a book of poetry is about 40 to 60 poems. So most of my books just started with me writing poems and accumulating enough to do a book. And I do want to say, I've been writing poetry all my life, but it wasn't until midlife that I started publishing poetry. I'm kind of the poster girl for midlife publishing. My first book came out when I was over 50. And in these last few years, I've been really very blessed to be generating new books. I do have one other book that I think we have a few copies in the back that's a little bit like Climbing the Fire Escape, Flipping the Raft, and that is my book, A Juror Must Fold In on Herself. That book grew out of my experience as the forewoman on a vehicular manslaughter case a few years before COVID. I believe it was 2018. And it was a very, very emotionally challenging experience to be on this jury. A child had been killed by a driver, and we on the jury had to deliberate about his negligence, and we had to watch a video showing the car hitting the family in the crosswalk. And that was a very, very difficult, emotionally difficult experience to do. And when that trial was all over, I wrote a poem to try to sort of process what that was like. And then I wrote a few more poems, and after about 3 or 4 of these jury poems, I thought to myself, I could probably write enough about my experience as a juror and then write about other jurors to do a book. And so that's how that book got generated, got birthed. And with Climbing the Fire Escape, as I mentioned, during COVID, I was watching all these movies, and at some point something kicked in. I think after 1 or 2 poems, and I can't remember which ones were the first poems that I wrote about women in movies, but after writing 1 or 2 of those poems, I thought, I could probably, watch movies the rest of my life. I will watch movies the rest of my life, but I'll write a lot more poems about women in movies, particularly these bold women doing bold things, climbing into murderers' apartments on the fire escape and so on. And so I would say that Climbing the Fire Escape is most like A Juror Must Fold In on Herself in terms of the project's origins. Yeah.
Well, and I love the agency at a time when we didn't feel like we had a lot of agency, and all the ways we tried to claim agency as a sort of important act of self-definition and resilience and joy, and this being one of them. I want to talk about form. I'm super curious about process and form, and so I'm going to go there. in this book, you use a lot of very specific forms. And often, as you did when you were reading, you indicate the form in the title of the poem. And so sonnets, villanelles, and some I'd never heard of, like you mentioned the abecedarian, which I had to look up and didn't even actually find referenced as a form of poetry, but was able to make the connection. Triolets and pantoums. This was a journey through poetic form and the constraints of poetic form. And so I guess what I'm wondering first is, when you write poetry, do you often use a specific form as a constraint that holds the poem? And do you decide that before you go in, or does the poem tell you it wants to be held in certain form or constraints?
I would say about 80% of the poems I write are in one form or another, and I gravitate to form. I've asked myself this question: why do I use form so much? And I like having some kind of vessel or some kind of some sort of vehicle that I can sort of jump into to then sort of swim across, or I like to think of the metaphor of a canoe. I get into the canoe of a sonnet, or I get into the canoe of a pantoum or an abecedarian, and that form provides me with the little vehicle that helps me get across, turbulent waters. I'm often trying to figure things out as I'm writing. I'm trying to sort of get at something below the surface. And I find that using a form helps take me there, helps get me across the choppy waters. And so I particularly love the sonnet, and I really love doing like the mirror sonnet, where you write the 14 lines and then you go back and kind of alter them slightly. And as far as do I know the form when I start off, sometimes I say to myself, I'm going to try this as a sestina and see if that works. And sestinas are particularly challenging form, but I like them a lot. And so I will sometimes say, okay, let's try this as a sestina. And if I can do 3 or 4 or 5 lines and it's sort of humming along, then I'm going to I'll stick with this form. But often I don't start with this is going to be a such and such form. I just start, and it often turns into a sonnet. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that I've been a community college teacher of English for over 30 years, and I've taught Shakespeare and other sonneteers and other users of form for so many years. And my job has been to sort of help students savor those forms and not be alienated by those forms. And I can remember this first sestina I ever wrote was in response to Elizabeth Bishop's poem, which is called Sestina. And I think if somebody were to ask me my favorite poem of all time, I think it would be that poem. It's about a grandchild with her grandmother sitting by a stove, and it's an absolutely beautiful poem. If you haven't read Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina, run, don't walk to read it. And thank you, Elizabeth, for inspiring me to write so many sestinas.
It strikes me a little bit like it's not hard enough to write poetry. You have to make it even harder for yourself. It's like it's not hard enough to play bridge. You have to play duplicate bridge with certain conventions of, just to really get a good workout, poetic workout. Well, I want to talk about some of the poems, and ironically, the ones that I wrote as ones I wanted to visit were ones that you read. So I feel like I just want everyone to know that I came independently to be curious about these. So The Rear Window was such a classic that it was very fun to hear it through the poetic form and to hear the ways the repetitive lines built the drama, parallel to how black and white films slowly build drama. I don't know if you want to say more about that poem for you and Grace Kelly in her high heels on the fire escape.
It's quite possible that might have been the poem that started this book, because I love that movie. I've seen that movie many times, and I'm a big Alfred Hitchcock fan, but just watching this this woman in the chiffon gown and the high heels. First of all, they're out there digging and looking for, clues out in the backyard. And then she starts climbing the fire escape, and we viewers know there's a murderer who lives in there. Don't climb those, but she does anyway. And so I was so, how to put it, fascinated with that character. And I just thought, I've got to write a poem about that character. And so the pantoum, because of the sort of the repetitive nature, it posed a challenge for me, because I'm sort of retelling what happens. And I am writing the poem for folks who have seen the movie, but I'm also trying, with all of these poems, to write a poem that can be enjoyed by someone who's not seen the movie. And so that's kind of working with me as I'm writing this poem about her climbing the fire escape. That's always on my mind when I'm writing, is like, will people who've had this experience sort of get it? If they've seen the movie, will they, enjoy the poem? Or if they haven't seen Rear Window, do I give them enough? And in this case, the sort of repetitive, over and over again, weaving in of lines, is that going to help the reader, the listener of the poem, appreciate the movie? And my fondest hope is that people will, if you haven't seen the movie, you will rush out and watch it. And that's partly why in the back of the book, I have a little glossary. And I have to thank Lynn Barnes, who's staffing the book table in the back, for giving me this idea. Lynn and I are in a poetry writing group together. And when I was working on this book, Lynn said, hey, how about you include a glossary that lists the movie, the year it was made, the writer, and the director. And I thought, what a great idea that is. So thank you, Lynn, for giving me that idea. And so that's in the back of the book. So my fondest hope is that you'll go see these movies for the first time, or see them, for the 12th time, as I have.
I loved that you did that in the back. I kind of wanted you to say, out of 5 stars, how many stars would you give the movie? Do you know what I mean?
There are some in the book.
Because we can watch some pretty bad things
-1.
during pandemic and write a poem about them.
Yes.
But maybe we'll get a signed copy. We'll have you do our little separate. And I can't, reading these poems, I couldn't read them as if they existed in a vacuum, right? I had to read them knowing that you were writing them during pandemic. So you're locked in a house or an apartment, and it's amazing what wild things can happen from an apartment or a house, right? So it's this interesting movie to get caught up in during pandemic. And as someone who grew up in New York City from the age of 8 on and lived in many apartments, one of the apartments, I just have to say, included an apartment in the Village in New York where, all sorts of characters lived in this little tiny brownstone building. And among the characters, it turned out, was the son of the Godfather, Carmen Galante, who we always knew there was a cop car in front of the house, but we just thought it was like a central location. But one day, the New York Times Magazine had an article about the mob in New York, and there was a picture of our mailboxes, because when things got too hot at Carmen Galante's girlfriend's house on the Upper West Side, he would come, hide out, and hang out at his son's apartment, and the cops wanted him to know they knew where he was. Then one day he was shot at a rooftop garden, and the next day the cop car was gone forever after. So totally, lots of drama can happen in a little apartment at any time. The Titanic was interesting too. So I'm so glad you read that one, watching Titanic on retreat in Tamales Bay. And I don't know what form this is, but it's the first line that repeats. I know how this ends.
The form is syllabic. Every line of that poem is 5 syllables long. I know how this ends. And then every other line is 5 syllables. And I wanted to just kind of keep repeating that because it is a film I've seen a lot of times. And there I am, on retreat, and I'm watching it, and I'm sort of thinking, why am I watching this for the 29th time. It was, enjoyable the first 2 or 3 times, but why am I watching it, here on retreat? And I genuinely was worried that the screaming on the screen was going to wake up the people next door, because they're drowning on the Titanic, and so. There's a funny story about that poem. I'd gone away on retreat and had been writing some serious stuff during my retreat, and then watched this movie, and did finally drift off around 3 a.m. Checked out in the morning and went to Heart's Desire Beach, which is very near where I was staying, and sat on the beach. It was a beautiful day in my little beach chair, and in about 20 minutes, kind of whipped off this poem. And just thought, this is a weird little poem. I'm going to do syllabics. I'm going to just keep writing. I know how this ends, and then kind of work my way through it's a kind of ridiculous plot that, the fiance chases her with a gun, and he keeps missing, and, it just was a ridiculous movie in a lot of ways, the plot of it anyway. And so on the beach, in 20 minutes, I whip off this little poem, and I'm thinking, this is a weird little poem, but I submitted it to a contest, and the Ina Coolbrith contest that we know about, and it won grand prize. And I thought, this is a little weird poem I wrote in 20 minutes. But the point I make of this in teaching is that it's sometimes the poems that we're least in love with or least obsessed with, that those are really the ones that matter. And so lighten up, don't be so serious all the time.
Wow, just think of the layers of that. You're in pandemic. You are watching, and I think many of us watched disaster movies during pandemic. We're like, well, at least I'm not on the Titanic, the worse the disaster movie, the better in some ways. So you're watching a movie about the Titanic, which you know how it ends. The vast majority of people die. You know how the movie ends. This one person survives. And you write a poem that you're not really thrilled about, and it came too easily. The poem has a refrain, I know how it ends, and yet it ends up winning prizes that you never would have predicted, right? The whole layers of that are super fun. Yeah. Do we know how it ends, We like to think we know how it ends. There's comfort in movies where we know how it ends, right? The good person gets the other good person, they live happily ever after. Of course, we don't see them 20 years into their marriage. We only see them when they ride off, when Elizabeth gets, what is his name? Oh, come on, in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth gets, starts with a G. Darcy starts with a D. Darcy, thank you. Anyway, who knows if they were happy? I don't know how it ends, but I like to think I know how it ends. So Thelma and Louise, again, against the backdrop, which I can't let go of pandemic, you imagine an alternate ending. And the power of being able to imagine an alternate ending than the one that we know happens.
And I have the Me Too movement to thank for that, because so many of us love that film. Here are these two women going off on a road trip, getting away from their routines, getting away from the humdrum. One of them's a waitress, and they're on this fishing trip, and so we viewers are so invested in this buddy film, this road film, and we want these women to thrive and find joy and have adventures, and then one of them is assaulted in a parking lot, and the other one shoots the rapist, and then they're on the lam, and I so wanted that movie to have a different ending. I didn't want these women to drive off the cliff and hold hands like, we're doing this together, here we go. And so when I watched that film again, with the kind of the Me Too movement in my mind, I just said, I am going to envision a different ending. And, if that film were remade now in 2025, it would have a different ending, and thanks to the Me Too movement. So, that's all I can say.
And beautiful to envision it, right? We're still working for that particular alternate ending. So the last one I want to talk about, and then we can open up and take some other questions about content or process or wherever you want to take this, is the Wizard of Oz poem. And this young girl who comes back changed. It reminds me of how Into the Woods, how the girl comes back changed, right? Little Red Riding Hood. You knew things then that you never knew before, and better is different than, what is it? Help me out. Different than good. Anyway. And she comes back, and you write this poem for Auntie M, this prayer and hope for her that she can listen to and imagine and enter imaginatively into the world that this girl sees, that she will want to doubt, and how much better it will be for both of them if she can lean in and suspend disbelief.
And, you know, I think I was using my deepest UU values when I was writing that poem, because basically I'm saying to Auntie M, listen to her. Just listen to her. Try not to like jump in and like, oh, that didn't happen, or you're exaggerating that, or oh, you know, how can you feel that way, or you know, those kinds of things that sometimes when we're listening to someone tell us something like, what? I can't even imagine that. You know, we're gonna like, oh, that could never happen, or and I'm basically just advising M to listen to Dorothy. Dorothy's going to tell you some things that are going to rock your world and sound really, really weird and really strange, but listen to her. And I'm sort of saying, you know, it'll take time. You know, she's been off having these adventures, you know, and one could interpret it, she's experienced trauma, you know, these flying monkeys have flown around with her. And so she's experienced trauma. So listen to Dorothy and be patient as she's kind of reintegrating back to, you know, black and white Kansas, and, you know, being there, hanging out with the farmhands and being on the farm again. And so I deliberately chose to end with that poem because it is that movie, you know, I think helped me become a writer. My grandmother gave me Wizard of Oz books that had belonged to my father when he was a little boy. She gave them to me as I was a child, and I still have them in my apartment. And The Wizard of Oz as a child just piqued my curiosity and my imagination so much. And that movie is really, really dear to me. And so I wanted to end the book with that particular poem. And also, I organized the book in terms of the first poem in the book is the most recently made movie. It's Jane Campion's film, The Power of the Dog. And then the book is organized sort of backwards in time, so that it, like the end poem is The Wizard of Oz, and the second to last poem is Rear Window. Wizard of Oz was made in the 1930s, and Rear Window was from the 1950s. And the poem that opens the book, The Power of the Dog, was made during COVID. I can remember seeing that film during COVID, one of the first movies we could go see in a theater. And I'm a little shocked and dismayed that of the 18 poems in the book, only one of these films was written and directed by a woman. That's Jane Campion, The Power of the Dog, which is sad to me. There are wonderful films out there that are written and directed by women, but not enough. And so let's keep making more films, and let's keep writing more poetry. And I'm interested to hear your questions. So thank you all for being here today.
I just want to add to that before we open it up is that I love that that's the message of The Wizard of Oz, this idea that we radically listen to one another's experience, because that's the only way we actually see the fullness of the world and fullness of truth. And as Unitarian Universalists, we do that about other people's religious experiences and understanding of ultimate truth. And I also want to say that I think it's an interesting one to end the volume with, because pandemic had a lot of gifts, the ability to dive into imaginative worlds, the agency of creation that was still ours, all the things that this volume speaks to. But one thing it also gave us that wasn't taken away from us was that when we came out of it, we did all come out of the same wild, unbelievable experience of the Oz that we were forced into by a storm, right? So at least we had that. We were not going to be disbelieved for what we went through, because for better and for worse, we all went through it together. So I love that as an. So let's, I can bring a mic around, or. I'm going to pass this one to you. Oh, I can just take this one, no? You want me to do that? Yeah, I'll just take one around. I'll be the MC. So does anyone have a question they want to ask Kathleen, or a poem you want her to read?
Well, I'm going to have a little conversation, actually. It's interesting that you don't feel comfortable or don't like the end of Thelma and Louise, because I loved it. And that's largely because I had spent my childhood watching films where women consistently were the victims at the end of movies. They didn't have autonomy. And think about the Stepford Wives as the sort of penultimate of being turned into the ultimate victim who's being replaced by a robot and then being killed. And at the same time, I was reading the existentialists, and that, human autonomy, ultimately the only choice we have is to wake up in the morning and live fully. And that when the system becomes too much, think Kafka, think The Stranger, then our choice over our bodily autonomy is the ultimate resistance that we have. So for me, Thelma and Louise has always been the turning point in cinematic history, where women went from being always the victims to having existential choice, finally becoming human beings in the realm of the cinematic. And then when I listened to, the poem on Oz, to hear the richness of humanity be brought into that relationship that is so often overlooked. Like, no one really gives us the interior of M's life and the relationship with Dorothy. So I love both of those pieces, and you made me think. So what a wonderful book of poetry. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. Thank you.
Although I'm thinking about when I was a kid and I didn't hear everything correctly, that one of the things I used to say was, "I'll bite my tie." She says, like, "I'll bide my time." So I was thinking, like, what a perfect... That phrase is coming to me in this room with all these ties. Anyway, I'll bite my tie. Right, exactly.
Yeah, I just have a question. I think I've seen all of the films on your list except Limbo. I was a big fan of John Sayles back in the 70s when he made films like The Return of the Secaucus Seven and lots of wonderful films about people interacting. And I'm wondering what it was that struck you about Limbo. I read your poem. You can read it if you like, but I just wanted to get if you can remember what you were thinking about.
Oh, well, if you haven't seen Limbo, it's beautifully filmed. It's set in the Pacific Northwest. It's actually set in Alaska, and it has to do with tourism and consumerism and the salmon industry and the changes that have happened to Alaskan indigenous people and the people who live in Alaska, and it's also a mystery. The two main characters and the main character who is a woman, her daughter, these three people get stranded on this little island, off the coast of Alaska, and they're bad guys that come and so on. But the main character is a nightclub singer, and her daughter is a high school student who's a writer. And so what I was interested in was the mother-daughter relationship. And so that's why I chose to write. A triolet is it is the shortest form. And so that particular poem zeroes in on the mother-daughter relationship between two creative women, the singer, the mom, and the daughter who's the writer. I highly recommend Limbo. It's got a lot of layers to it, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Has anyone seen Limbo? Am I characterizing the film? How so? How so?
Uh-oh, are we having spoiler alert moments? Should I give her the mic or keep it away from her, folks?
I can't remember. it traumatized me. So I cannot remember. But I do remember that
it has a really
nuts.
ambiguous ending. Like, we don't know
Yes.
who's on board that
Totally,
plane.
totally.
It's a very ambiguous ending. Really.
So
don't
we
know
need
if-
5-star ratings, but then we need the trauma ratings. So you can balance, since it's not pandemic, there are lots of things that are traumatic, but you might not want to watch a totally traumatic movie. That's what we watch them for, the car crashes.
So I'm just hoping you'll read it. It's short.
Oh, it's very short. Okay. Limbo Triolet.
And now I know how to pronounce that form.
Limbo Triolet for Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio. You sang torch songs in clubs. Your daughter writes elusive tales of frontier families who strive but fail to outlast cold, wet nights. You sang torch songs in clubs. Your daughter writes, you're stranded, warmed by feeble firelight, the branches snapped from island hemlock trees. You sang torch songs. Not now. Your daughter writes elusive tales of frontier families.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of enigmatic poem because the film has this very enigmatic end, which I liked. I mean, nobody's driving off a cliff, but
All right. All right. I feel like this is raising the idea that maybe we should have a movie club. I mean, additional, we have sensible cinema, but mainstream. Movie and poetry.
I just wanted to mention that in the one about the Wizard of Oz, that it really struck me when you said she went back to her home and Auntie M, who had never seen such colors. It was like, oh, it was such a good description of Auntie M's life, that part of her life. Yeah, and I thought, yeah, those people didn't see those kind of colors until much later, or if a magazine happened to, be in their life somewhere. But anyway, interesting.
I just want to say that the liveliness of this conversation and what's going on in my head really speaks to the joy of poetry. That at any moment when we read a poem and we start saying, but, or look at the colors, or, but wait a minute, when you get that reaction to poems, then the poetry is really singing to us. And so I just wanted to not let the discussion be so heady that we forget to say how moved we are by the poetry. So thank you.
thank you too. And to end on, a light note and a highly caloric note, we have a cake over to my left that, due to the wizardry of Safeway, has the book cover embedded into the frosting. So Tom, would you take a picture of the cake before we cut into it? Oh, you did? Okay, great.
Right.
So please, have a big slice. There's lots of cake. It's chocolate cake, and it's got raspberry filling inside. And please have a big, big piece. And thank you very much for coming today. I so appreciate your attention. Thank you very
Yay,
much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Kathleen, and it's fitting that we therefore end a beautiful set of poetry. It speaks to the creative urge in the midst of difficult times, at the end of at least the pandemic, that we say in the spirit of Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake.